The silence that followed my question was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. Before we continue, please write in the comments which country you're listening from. Enjoy the story. My name is Dorothy Washington, and at 52 years old, I've learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon you can wield is a simple question asked at exactly the right moment. That Thanksgiving dinner will forever be etched in my memory, not because of the perfectly golden turkey I'd spent hours preparing, or the homemade cranberry sauce that took me 3 attempts to get right, but because of the moment my son-in-law, Richard, decided to publicly humiliate me in front of our entire family. We were all gathered around my dining room table. Well, what everyone assumed was my daughter Jessica's dining room table. The mahogany surface gleamed under the chandelier light, reflecting the faces of people I'd grown to love and, in some cases, tolerate. Jessica sat to my right, her nurse's uniform traded for a beautiful burgundy dress that complemented her dark skin. She looked tired. 12-hour shifts at the hospital would do that to anyone, but happy to have everyone together. Richard sat across from me, his chest puffed out like a peacock showing his feathers. At 35, he carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly challenged. His sandy brown hair was perfectly styled, his button-down shirt crisp and expensive-looking. He worked as a regional sales manager for some mid-tier tech company, and if you asked him, you'd think he was running Fortune 500 operations. His parents, Margaret and Robert Patterson, flanked him on either side. They were pleasant enough people, but they'd raised Richard to believe that his way was the only way, and that anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of success was somehow lacking. Margaret taught elementary school for 30 years before retiring, and Robert had worked in middle management at an insurance company. Solid, respectable jobs, the kind that come with predictable paychecks and retirement plans. The conversation had been flowing pleasantly enough. We'd covered the usual topics: the weather, Jessica's work at the hospital, Richard's latest sales numbers, the Patterson family's recent vacation to Florida. I mostly listened, contributing when appropriate, content to watch my family enjoy the meal I'd prepared. That's when Richard decided to turn his attention to me. "So, Dorothy," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he thought he was being clever. "When are you finally going to get a real job?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I felt Jessica tense beside me, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. Margaret let out a small, nervous laugh. Robert cleared his throat and reached for his wine glass. But Richard wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "I mean, come on. You sit at home all day, typing on your computer. That's not really work, is it? When's the last time you had to wake up at 6 a.m., put on real clothes, and go to an actual office?" Margaret giggled. Actually giggled, like her 35-year-old son had just told the most amusing joke. "Oh, Richard, you're terrible," she said, but her tone suggested she found his observation rather astute. Robert nodded sagely. "There's something to be said for the discipline of traditional employment," he added. "Shows up on time, follows directions, works as part of a team." I felt heat rising in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. This wasn't the first time. Richard had made comments about my fake job, as he liked to call it. Over the 3 years he'd been married to my daughter, he'd made countless little digs. Jokes about how I played on the computer all day. Comments about how nice it must be to not have real responsibilities. Suggestions that maybe I should look into actual employment now that I was getting older. Jessica had asked me not to make waves. "Mom, you know how Richard is," she'd say. "He doesn't mean anything by it. He comes from a different world than we do. Different world indeed." Richard came from a world where a woman's worth was measured by how visible her work was to others, where sitting behind a desk from 9 to 5 somehow made you more valuable than someone who worked from home, where the size of your office mattered more than the size of your accomplishments. "Richard," Jessica said quietly, her voice carrying a warning tone, "Mom works very hard." "Doing what exactly?" Richard pressed, now fully committed to his performance. "Answering emails, Having Zoom calls in her pajamas? Come on, Jess. Your mom needs structure, purpose, a reason to get up and contribute to society. That's when I'd had enough. I set down my fork carefully, folded my hands in my lap, and looked directly into Richard's eyes. The smirk on his face suggested he thought he'd finally cornered me, finally proven his point about my worthless existence. I smiled, not a warm, grandmother-like smile, but the kind of smile I used in boardrooms. When someone had severely underestimated me, "How does it feel," I asked, my voice calm and clear, "to know that this fake job pays for your house?" The silence that followed was deafening. To understand how we got to that moment, you need to know my story. 25 years ago, I was Dorothy Williams, a junior analyst at Morrison & Associates, one of the most prestigious consulting firms in Atlanta. I wore tailored suits, carried a leather briefcase, and worked 14-hour days, helping Fortune 500 companies streamline their operations and maximize their profits. I was good at what I did, damn good. I had an eye for inefficiencies that others missed, a talent for seeing solutions where others saw only problems. Within 5 years, I'd been promoted to senior consultant. Within 10, I was leading multi-million-dollar projects for clients across the Southeast. But corporate America, in the late 90s, wasn't always kind to ambitious black women. I faced obstacles that my white male colleagues never even knew existed. Clients who requested someone more senior when I walked into their boardrooms. Colleagues who credited my successes to luck or affirmative action. A glass ceiling that seemed made of reinforced steel. When Jessica was born, I thought I'd found the perfect excuse to step back, to focus on motherhood while keeping one foot in the corporate world. Her father, Marcus, was a good man, a high school history teacher with a gentle soul and progressive ideals. He supported my career ambitions, encouraged me to dream bigger, to reach higher. We were happy for 8 beautiful years. Marcus would grade papers while I worked on client presentations. We'd take turns reading bedtime stories to Jessica, tag-teaming parent-teacher conferences, building what I thought was our forever life. The car accident that took Marcus happened on a rainy Tuesday in March. Jessica was 8 years old, and suddenly I was a widow with a mortgage, bills, and a daughter who needed me more than any corporate client ever could. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of grieving myself into obscurity or settling for a lesser position that would accommodate my single mother status, I decided to bet on myself in a way I'd never dared before. I left Morrison & Associates and started Washington Strategic, solutions from my kitchen table. My former clients knew my worth, even if my former employers had failed to fully recognize it. Within 6 months, I had 3 major contracts. Within a year, I'd hired my first employee, a brilliant analyst named Patricia who worked remotely from her home in Savannah. The beauty of consulting is that results matter more than location. My clients didn't care if I wore pajamas to our video calls as long as I could save them millions in operational costs. They didn't need to see me in a corner office as long as I could deliver comprehensive strategic plans on time and under budget. While other people saw me as a work-from-home mom in yoga pants, I was building something extraordinary. Washington Strategic Solutions grew quietly, steadily. I specialized in organizational restructuring, process optimization, and change management, the kind of unglamorous work that makes companies billions but happens entirely behind the scenes. By the time Jessica graduated high school, my company had 12 employees and offices in 3 cities. By the time she finished nursing school, we'd expanded to serve clients nationwide. When she married Richard 3 years ago, Washington Strategic Solutions was generating over $8 million in annual revenue. But I kept quiet about all of this. Old habits from my corporate days, I suppose. I'd learned that success could make people uncomfortable, especially when it came from someone they didn't expect to succeed. I dressed modestly, drove a reliable but unremarkable car, lived in the same modest house I'd bought when Jessica was young. Richard had never bothered to ask detailed questions about my work. When Jessica told him her mother did consulting from home, he'd immediately categorized me as one of those women who sold essential oils or managed social media for small businesses. Something cute and harmless that helped pay for groceries, but wasn't real work. The irony was delicious, really. Richard prided himself on his sales performance, bragging about his annual income of $85,000 like he was some kind of mogul. He had no idea that I'd earned more than that in the past month alone. He'd moved into what he thought was Jessica's house right after their wedding, never questioning how a nurse could afford a 4-bedroom colonial in one of Atlanta's most desirable neighborhoods. He assumed it was a stretch for her, probably financed with a hefty mortgage and help from family. He had no idea that I'd bought that house outright 5 years earlier, not as my primary residence, but as an investment property. When Jessica and Richard got engaged, I quietly transferred the deed to Jessica as an early wedding gift. The mortgage payments Richard thought they were making? They went straight into a savings account I'd set up for Jessica's future. Richard treated me like a charity case, the aging mother-in-law who needed to be tolerated and occasionally humored. He'd make jokes about my computer games, suggest I look into real jobs at the grocery store or department stores, offer to help me write a resume when I was ready to join the workforce. Margaret and Robert Patterson had raised their son to believe that visible work was valuable work, that traditional employment was the only legitimate path to success. They couldn't conceive of a world where someone could build an empire from their dining room table. The disrespect had been building for 3 years, but I'd tolerated it for Jessica's sake. She loved Richard, and he made her happy in ways that mattered. He was good to her, faithful and devoted, even if he had a blind spot the size of Texas when it came to understanding women who didn't fit his narrow worldview. But that Thanksgiving, something had shifted. Maybe it was the public nature of his ridicule, performed for his parents' entertainment like I was some kind of court jester. Maybe it was the way he doubled down, pressing harder when he should have recognized the warning signs. Or maybe I'd simply reached the end of my patience with being treated like a burden when I was actually the foundation holding everything together. The months leading up to that Thanksgiving had been particularly challenging. Richard's comments about my fake job had become more frequent, more pointed, more public. It started small, little jokes during family dinners, casual comments when friends visited, subtle digs that Jessica would laugh off or ignore. "Mom's having another important business call," he'd say, with air quotes when I'd excuse myself, "to take client meetings. Must be nice to play pretend CEO all day." During Jessica's birthday dinner in September, he'd actually suggested I look into getting a job at Target. "They're always hiring," he'd said, cutting into his steak. "Good. Benefits, steady hours. Might be good for you to interact with real people instead of hiding behind that computer screen all day." Margaret had nodded approvingly. "Structure is so important at your age, Dorothy. And retail work keeps you active, on your feet. Much better than sitting around the house." I'd smiled politely and changed the subject, but inside I was calculating how much revenue my sitting around the house had generated that week. The answer was roughly $200,000 from a single contract restructuring proposal I'd submitted to a manufacturing client in Tennessee. The disrespect wasn't limited to family gatherings. When their friends came over for barbecues or game nights, Richard would inevitably find ways to highlight my unemployed status. "Dorothy's got it made," he'd tell his buddies while flipping burgers. "Works from home, sets her own hours, basically retired early. Must be nice not having real responsibilities." His friend Mike, who sold insurance, had actually offered to help me get started in his industry. "It's perfect for older ladies," he'd explained earnestly. "Flexible schedule, work from home when you want, build your client base gradually. I could introduce you to my manager." I'd thanked him politely while mentally comparing his annual commission potential to the monthly retainer I received from just one of my Fortune 500 clients. The worst part wasn't Richard's ignorance. It was watching Jessica navigate between defending me and keeping peace in her marriage. I'd catch her shooting apologetic glances my way when Richard made his comments, or quickly changing subjects when conversations turned to my career situation. "Mom, you know he doesn't mean anything by it," she'd say when we were alone. He's very traditional about work. He doesn't understand consulting or remote work. He thinks if you're not in an office, you're not really working." But I could see the strain it was putting on her. Jessica was caught between loyalty to her mother and love for her husband, trying to maintain harmony in a situation that was becoming increasingly untenable. The breaking point came 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. Richard had invited some colleagues from his company over to watch football. I was in my home office, what Richard referred to as my computer room, taking a video conference with executives from an aerospace company in Seattle. We were discussing a $50 million operational overhaul that would potentially save them hundreds of jobs while increasing efficiency by 30%. In the middle of this crucial presentation, Richard burst through my office door with his coworkers in tow. "See, guys? This is what I was telling you about," he announced loudly. "My mother-in-law's got the perfect setup. Works from home, makes her own schedule, basically gets paid to surf the internet all day." I was mortified. Here I was, on camera, with some of the most powerful executives in the aerospace industry, and my son-in-law was treating my professional workspace like a tourist attraction. I quickly muted my microphone and turned away from the camera. "Richard, I'm in the middle of an important meeting. Please take your friends to the living room." "Oh, come on," he laughed. "What kind of meeting?" "Let me guess. Someone wants you to organize their closet or plan their cousin's wedding." His friends chuckled, but I could see confusion in their eyes. My office didn't look like a hobby room. I had multiple monitors, professional lighting for video conferences, whiteboards covered with strategic planning diagrams, shelves lined with business books and industry reports. "Richard," I said again, more firmly this time, "I need privacy for this call." Fine, he said, but he was still grinning. "Sorry to interrupt your very important internet browsing, Dorothy." When they finally left, I had to apologize profusely to the Seattle executives. I could see the questions in their eyes. Who was this unprofessional woman who couldn't maintain proper boundaries during a business meeting? It took me 3 follow-up calls and a detailed written proposal to repair the damage Richard had done to my professional reputation in those 5 minutes. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the humiliation over and over. I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue, all the moments I'd let Richard's ignorance slide for the sake of family harmony. I thought about the empire I'd built in silence, the respect I commanded in boardrooms across the country, the millions of dollars I'd generated while Richard bragged about his quarterly sales figures. Something had to change. I couldn't continue living this double life, being diminished and disrespected in my own family while commanding authority and admiration in the business world. The disconnect was becoming unbearable. I started paying closer attention to Richard's behavior, documenting the pattern of disrespect that I'd been tolerating for far too long. Every condescending comment, every public humiliation, every suggestion that I needed to get a real job, I began cataloging it all. What I discovered was even worse than I'd realized. Richard wasn't just ignorant about my work. He was actively undermining my relationship with Jessica, poisoning her perception of her mother's contributions to the family. I overheard him telling Jessica that she needed to have a conversation with her mom about contributing more financially. He suggested that maybe I should pay rent if I was going to freeload off their generosity. He complained that my presence in the house made it harder for them to build their own life together. The irony was staggering. Here was a man living in a house I owned, eating meals I cooked, enjoying a lifestyle subsidized by my success, all while lobbying his wife to demand more financial contribution from me. But I kept quiet, kept observing, kept building my case. Because I'd learned something important in my years as a consultant. The best strategies aren't reactive, they're proactive. You don't respond to disrespect with emotion. You respond with facts, with evidence, with undeniable truth. The incident that finally broke my resolve happened 2 weeks after the office interruption. I was in my kitchen, preparing dinner and half listening to Richard and Jessica's conversation in the living room. They thought I couldn't hear them, but sound travels in that house more than they realized. "Babe, I've been thinking," Richard said, his voice taking on that tone he used when he thought he was being particularly clever. "Your mom's always talking about her consulting work, right? Well, if she's really making decent money from it, maybe she could help us out with something." I paused in my vegetable chopping, my knife hovering over a carrot. Something in his tone made my skin crawl. "Help us out? How?" Jessica asked, and I could hear the wariness in her voice. "Well, you know that investment opportunity I told you about? My buddy Dave from the golf club has this inside track on some commercial real estate deals. Nothing risky, just solid investments that could really set us up for the future." My blood ran cold. I knew exactly what this was leading to. "Richard, we talked about this," Jessica said firmly. "We're not in a position to make big investments right now. Between my student loans and the mortgage, we're barely staying ahead as it is. But that's exactly why we need to think bigger, Jess. We can't just keep living paycheck to paycheck forever. And your mom, if she's really doing as well as she claims with her little computer business, maybe she'd be willing to loan us the money. It's a win-win. She gets to help her daughter's family get ahead, and we pay her back with interest." I felt something sharp and cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just disrespect anymore. This was manipulation. Richard was planning to use Jessica's love for me to pressure me into funding his get-rich-quick schemes. "I don't know, Richard," Jessica said quietly. "Mom's been so generous already. I don't feel comfortable asking her for money." "Come on," Richard pressed. "She's sitting on money she's not even using. What's she saving it for? She doesn't have a mortgage, doesn't have car payments, barely goes anywhere or buys anything. That money could be working for all of us instead of just sitting in some bank account earning nothing." I had to grip the kitchen counter to steady myself. The audacity was breathtaking. Here was a man who routinely mocked my work, dismissed my professional achievements, and treated me like a financial burden, now scheming to get his hands on money. He assumed I had. But what made it worse was the way he was manipulating Jessica, making her feel guilty for not pressuring her own mother to fund their lifestyle. I don't think that's appropriate," Jessica said, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. "Think about it, babe. Your mom loves you. She wants to see you succeed. And this isn't like we're asking for charity. We'd pay her back with interest. Better interest than any bank would give her, probably. It's actually a favor to her when you think about it." I heard Jessica sigh. "How much money are we talking about?" "Well, to really make it worthwhile, Dave says we'd need to bring at least 50,000 to the table. Maybe 75 to be safe. But the returns could be incredible, Jess. We're talking about potentially doubling our money in 2 years. $50,000 to $75,000. Money that Richard assumed I had just lying around because I didn't spend it on anything important. Money he wanted Jessica to ask for so he could fund some dubious real estate scheme with his golf buddy. "I don't know," Jessica said again. "That's a lot of money to ask for." "Your mom's got it," Richard said with complete confidence. "Trust me, women like her always have money stashed away. They're afraid to spend it on themselves, so they just hoard it. At least this way, it would be going towards something that benefits the family." Women like her. The phrase echoed in my head like a slap. Women like what, exactly? Women who worked hard and saved their money? Women who built businesses from nothing? Women who sacrificed and planned for the future instead of chasing get-rich-quick schemes? "Maybe I could mention it to her," Jessica said finally, "just to see what she thinks. Not asking directly, but just feeling her out." "That's my girl," Richard said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "You know what? Don't even frame it as asking for money. Just tell her about the opportunity. Let her know that we wish we could take advantage of it, but we don't have the capital. She'll probably offer to help on her own. The manipulation was masterful, I had to admit. Richard was coaching Jessica on how to emotionally manipulate her own mother without even realizing what she was doing. He was turning my daughter into an unwitting accomplice in his scheme to separate me from my money. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the conversation, analyzing every word, every inflection. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became, not just at Richard, but at myself. How had I allowed this situation to develop? How had I let this man move into my house, eat my food, benefit from my generosity, all while planning to exploit my relationship with my daughter? The next morning, Jessica approached me while I was having coffee on the back porch. She looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with her hands, and avoiding direct eye contact. "Mom, can I talk to you about something?" "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" She sat down beside me, still not quite meeting my eyes. Richard mentioned this investment opportunity, something about commercial real estate. It sounds really promising, but we don't have the kind of money they're looking for. I kept my expression neutral, even though my heart was racing. What kind of money are they looking for? Well, that's the thing. It's substantial, like $50,000 or more. Which is obviously way beyond what we can do right now. She paused, clearly struggling with what to say next. Richard thought he suggested that since you've been doing so well with your consulting work, maybe you'd want to know about the opportunity? There it was. The moment of truth. My daughter, unknowingly following her husband's script, trying to manipulate her own mother into funding Richard's fantasies. I took a sip of my coffee, buying myself time to think. This was bigger than disrespect now. This was about financial exploitation, about Richard using Jessica as a weapon against me. It was about a man who saw me as nothing more than a potential ATM, while simultaneously mocking the work that had earned every dollar he wanted to spend. "Tell me more about this opportunity," I said calmly, as Jessica relayed the details, most of which sounded exactly like the kind of too-good-to-be-true schemes that separated fools from their money. I made a decision that would change everything. 1. Was time to stop being the invisible woman in my own family. Time to stop letting Richard's ignorance and greed go unchallenged. Time to show him exactly who he'd been underestimating all these years. But I wouldn't do it emotionally. I wouldn't do it in anger. I would do it the way I handled everything else in my professional life, strategically, methodically, and with devastating effectiveness. That afternoon, I locked myself in my home office and began what I like to call a strategic audit. If Richard wanted to play games with money, he was about to discover he'd challenged the wrong woman. I pulled out my filing cabinet, the one Richard had probably assumed was filled with household documents and old tax returns. Instead, I spread across my desk the documentation of an empire he never knew existed. First, I reviewed the deed to the house where Jessica and Richard lived. Purchase price, $450,000, paid in cash. Date of purchase, 5 years ago. Current market value, approximately $620,000. Owner, Dorothy Washington, transferred to Jessica Washington Patterson as a wedding gift. Richard had no idea he was living in a house that I had bought outright, in cash, before he'd even met my daughter. Next, I opened my business financial statements. Washington Strategic Solutions had grown beyond even my own ambitious projections. Current annual revenue, $12.7 million. Net profit margins, 38%. Client roster, 47 companies, including 8 Fortune 500 corporations and 3 government agencies. My personal portfolio was even more impressive. Real estate holdings, 7 properties across 3 states with a combined value of over $4 million. Stock investments, diversified portfolio worth $2.1 million. Business assets, company valuation at approximately $15 million. Liquid assets, Enough cash reserves to buy Richard's entire lifestyle 10 times over. The irony was delicious. While Richard was bragging about his $85,000 salary and scheming to get his hands on my savings, I was managing a personal net worth that exceeded $20 million. I pulled up my most recent client contracts. Johnson & Associates Manufacturing had just signed a 2-year deal worth $3.2 million. Atlas Corporation was paying me $600,000 for a 6-month operational restructuring. The Department of Transportation contract I'd landed last month, $800,000 for strategic planning services. In the past quarter alone, I'd earned more money than Richard would make in the next decade. But the real revelation came when I started digging deeper into the house situation. I'd purchased the property as an investment, yes, but I'd also been quietly paying what Richard thought was their mortgage. Every month, he'd transfer what he believed was his half of the house payment to Jessica's account. What he didn't know was that Jessica had been transferring that money, at my instruction, into a savings account I'd set up for her future. Richard had been living completely rent-free for 3 years while congratulating himself on being a responsible homeowner. I pulled out my phone and called my financial advisor, Patricia Coleman. Patricia had been managing my investments for 7 years, and she'd grown accustomed to my unusual requests for discretion. "Dorothy, good to hear from you. How are things?" "Complicated, Patricia. I need you to prepare a comprehensive portfolio. Summary. Everything. Business assets, real estate holdings, investment accounts, the works. I need it detailed enough that even someone with limited financial knowledge could understand the scope." "May I ask what this is for?" I smiled grimly. "Let's call it a family education initiative." "I can have that ready by tomorrow morning. Do you want me to include the property transfers as well?" "Especially the property transfers. I want everything. Documented. Purchase dates, transfer dates, current market values. Make sure the Jessica's house is prominently featured. Consider it done. Dorothy, is everything all right? This isn't like your usual requests." I thought about that question. Was everything all right? In one sense, no. My family dynamics were a mess. My son-in-law was plotting to exploit me financially. And my daughter was caught in the middle of a situation she didn't fully understand. But in another sense, everything was about to become very right indeed. "Everything's fine, Patricia. Actually, everything's about to be much better." After hanging up, I opened my laptop and began reviewing my most recent business communications. In just the past week, I'd exchanged emails with the CEO of a major airline about restructuring their customer service operations, advised a pharmaceutical company on supply chain optimization, and submitted a proposal to help a tech startup scale their operations for rapid growth. I scrolled through my calendar for the coming month. Board meetings, client presentations, strategy sessions with corporate executives who paid me more for a single consultation than Richard earned in a month. Tomorrow, I had a video conference with Boeing about a potential multi-million-dollar contract. Next week, I was flying to Chicago to present restructuring recommendations to a manufacturing company's board of directors. The week after that, I'd be in Washington, D.C., meeting with Department of Defense officials about optimizing their procurement processes. This was my fake job. This was what Richard dismissed as playing on the computer all day. I leaned back in my chair and surveyed my office with new eyes. The multiple monitors weren't just for show. I used them to manage complex data analysis across multiple client projects simultaneously. The whiteboards weren't decorative. They were covered with strategic frameworks and process optimization diagrams that had saved companies millions of dollars. The shelves of business books weren't for decoration. They were reference materials. I consulted regularly to stay ahead of industry trends and best practices. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Thompson, CEO of Thompson Industries. "Dorothy, just wanted to thank you again for the supply chain recommendations. We're already seeing 15% cost reductions across all our manufacturing facilities. The board is thrilled. When can we discuss Phase 2? 15%. Cost reductions. For a company Thompson Industries' size, that represented savings in the tens of millions. And Marcus was already asking about Phase 2. I screenshotted the message and saved it to a folder I was building, evidence of my fake job's real-world impact. Another text came in, this time from Sarah Mitchell, the CFO of Atlanta Medical Systems. Dorothy, the operational efficiency improvements you recommended have been extraordinary. We're processing 30% more patients with the same staffing levels. The hospital board wants to discuss expanding our contract to include all 7 facilities in our network. 30% efficiency improvements in healthcare. That meant shorter wait times for patients, reduced stress on medical staff, and better healthcare outcomes for thousands of people. But according to Richard, I wasn't contributing to society. I spent the next 2 hours compiling what I started thinking of as my Richard reality check file. Financial statements, client testimonials, contract summaries, property documents, everything I needed to paint a complete picture of who Dorothy Washington really was. The woman Richard saw was a creation of my own making, a deliberate choice, to keep my professional success separate from my personal life. I'd learned long ago that money could complicate family relationships, that success could breed resentment and unrealistic expectations. But my strategy of flying under the radar had backfired spectacularly. Instead of protecting my family relationships, it had enabled my son-in-law to disrespect and underestimate me while plotting to exploit my financial resources. As I organized the documents, I found myself thinking about my late husband, Marcus. He'd always encouraged me to be proud of my achievements, to own my success instead of hiding it. Dorothy, he used to say, you don't make yourself smaller to make other people comfortable. That's not helping anyone. He'd been right, of course. By hiding my success, I hadn't protected anyone. I'd just enabled Richard's ignorance and arrogance to flourish unchecked. It was time for a different approach. Time to stop being the invisible woman in my own family's story. The next morning, Patricia's comprehensive portfolio summary arrived via secure email, and it was even more impressive than I'd remembered. Seeing everything laid out in one document, the business valuations, property holdings, investment returns, and cash reserves, I realized that even I had been underestimating my own success. But Patricia had included something extra that made my strategic mind start racing. She'd done a background check on Richard's financial situation. I took the liberty of running a credit and financial analysis on your son-in-law, her note read. Given your request for family education materials, I thought you might find this information useful. Richard Patterson's financial profile painted a very different picture from the successful sales manager persona he projected. His credit score was mediocre at best, hovering around 650. He had outstanding credit card debt totaling nearly $30,000 across 6 different cards. His car loan was upside down. He owed more than the vehicle was worth. Most telling of all, he'd been declined for a mortgage pre-approval just 6 months before marrying Jessica. That last piece of information hit me like a thunderbolt. Richard couldn't qualify for a mortgage on his own, which meant he never could have afforded the house he was living in, even with Jessica's nursing salary. He was entirely dependent on what he assumed was Jessica's financial situation, not knowing that Jessica's ability to afford the house came entirely from my gift to her. I dug deeper into Patricia's research. Richard's employment history showed a pattern of job hopping, with 3 different sales positions in the past 5 years. His current role at TechFlow Solutions was his longest tenure, but according to the industry research Patricia had included, TechFlow was struggling financially. There had been 2 rounds of layoffs in the past 18 months. The investment opportunity Richard was so excited about? Patricia had researched that too. Dave Morrison, Richard's golf buddy, had been involved in 2 previous real estate ventures that had gone bust. The inside track commercial real estate deals were actually distressed properties with significant environmental and legal issues. Any competent financial advisor would have run screaming from the investment. Richard was trying to talk Jessica into. I printed everything and spread it across my conference table like a battle plan. On one side, the documentation of my success, contracts worth millions, properties owned outright, a business empire built from determination and intelligence. On the other side, the reality of Richard's situation, debt, financial instability, and schemes that would likely lose any money invested in them. The contrast was stark, but it gave me exactly what I needed: leverage. My phone rang, interrupting my strategic planning. The caller ID showed Johnson & Associates Manufacturing. "Dorothy, this is Rebecca Johnson. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Rebecca Johnson, CEO of a $3 billion manufacturing company, was calling to chat. But according to Richard, I didn't have a real job. "Not at all, Rebecca. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to personally thank you for the operational restructuring you completed for us last quarter. The efficiency improvements have exceeded every projection. Our board is so impressed, they're recommending you for the National Manufacturing Excellence Award." I nearly dropped the phone. The National Manufacturing Excellence Award was the industry's highest honor, recognizing individuals who had made extraordinary contributions to American manufacturing competitiveness. That's incredible, Rebecca. I'm honored. I should be. What you accomplished here, reducing waste by 40% while increasing output by 25%, it's revolutionary. We've had CEOs from other companies calling us, asking how we did it. After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence. While Richard was mocking my computer games, I was being nominated for one of the most prestigious awards in American business. Called my assistant, Maria Santos, who managed my schedule from her home office in Miami. "Maria, I need you to clear my calendar for the next week. Something's come up that requires my immediate attention." "Of course, Dorothy. Should I reschedule the Boeing presentation?" "No, keep that one. But move everything else. And Maria, I need you to prepare presentation materials about Washington's strategic solutions. Something comprehensive that showcases our client roster, major projects, and business achievements. Make it impressive, but accessible, like you're explaining it to someone who doesn't understand consulting." "Are you pitching to a new client?" I smiled grimly. "You could say that. I'm pitching to my family." That afternoon, I drove to Jessica's hospital to have lunch with her. As we sat in the cafeteria, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a busy medical center, I started laying the groundwork for what was to come. "Jessica, how much do you know about what I actually do for work?" She looked surprised by the question. "You do consulting, right? Help businesses with organizational stuff?" "What kind of businesses?" She paused, clearly realizing she didn't really know. "I'm not sure." "Small companies, I guess? Richard always says you work with local businesses, helping them with computers and things." "Richard says that, does he?" "Mom, you know Richard doesn't really understand consulting work. He's just used to traditional jobs where you go to an office and have a boss. He doesn't mean anything bad by it." I nodded, choosing my words carefully. "What would you say if I told you that next month I'm presenting to the board of directors of one of the largest companies in America?" Jessica looked confused. "What kind of presentation?" "Strategic recommendations that could save them over $100 million in operational costs." She stared at me for a long moment. "Mom, are you being serious right now?" "Completely serious." "What would you say if I told you that last year, my company generated over $12 million in revenue?" The color drained from Jessica's face. That can't be right. Mom, $12 million? What would you say if I told you that I own 7 properties worth over $4 million combined? I would say you're either joking or I don't know my own mother at all. I reached across the table and took her hand. "Jessica, there's a lot about my work that I haven't shared with you. I kept quiet about it because I didn't want money to complicate our relationship. But I'm starting to realize that keeping quiet has created bigger problems." "What kind of problems?" I thought about Richard's schemes, his disrespect, his plans to exploit what he saw as my financial vulnerability. The kind where people make assumptions about who I am and what I'm capable of, the kind where those assumptions lead to unfortunate decisions. Jessica was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd told her. Finally, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me? All these years, I thought. I worried about your finances. I worried about your future. I felt guilty about not being able to help you more. I know, honey, and I'm sorry for that. But I want you to understand something important. I've never needed financial help. What I've needed is respect. What I've needed is for my family to see me as the capable, successful woman I actually am, instead of the burden they assume me to be." She was crying now, and I could see the pieces starting to come together in her mind. "Richard doesn't know any of this, does he?" "No, he doesn't. And based on his recent behavior, I think it's time he learned." The transformation began subtly. I started taking business calls in common areas of the house instead of hiding away in my office. When Jessica and Richard were watching television, in the living room, I'd answer my phone in the kitchen, speaking loudly enough for them to overhear. "Yes, Senator Williams, I understand the urgency of the healthcare efficiency project. We can have preliminary recommendations to your office by Friday." I watched Richard's head turn from the corner of my eye. "Senator Williams?" He was clearly trying to figure out if I was talking to an actual senator or if this was some elaborate role-playing game. The next day, while Richard was making his morning coffee, I took a call from the CEO of Atlanta's largest hospital system. "Good morning, David. Yes, I received the board's approval for Phase 3 of the operational restructuring. We're looking at implementing the new patient flow protocols across all 12 facilities." Richard was openly staring now, his coffee forgotten in his hand. "The projected savings of $8.5 million annually? Yes, that's conservative. Based on our pilot program results, we'll likely exceed those numbers by 20%. I ended the call and smiled pleasantly at Richard. "Morning, Richard. Sleep well?" He just nodded, clearly confused, but not quite ready to ask direct questions. That afternoon, I made sure to be in the living room when my video conference with Boeing executives began. I'd deliberately chosen the couch facing the kitchen, where Richard was preparing lunch, and I'd positioned my laptop so the Boeing logo was clearly visible on my screen. "Gentlemen, thank you for your time today. I've reviewed your manufacturing inefficiencies, and I believe we can reduce production costs by 30% while improving quality control measures." I could see Richard frozen in the kitchen doorway, holding a sandwich and staring at my screen. The Boeing executives were discussing budget allocations in the hundreds of millions, and I was responding with the casual confidence of someone who handled such numbers regularly. "The initial investment of $2.7 million for the restructuring will pay for itself within 6 months, I continued. "After that, you're looking at annual savings of approximately $15 million. When the call ended, Richard approached cautiously. "Mom, were you just talking to Boeing? Like the airplane company?" "Yes, they're one of my clients. We're working on optimizing their manufacturing processes." I said it as casually as if I'd been discussing the weather. "You work with Boeing?" "Among others. Why do you ask?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly struggling to process this information. I didn't know you worked with big companies like that." "Richard, you've never asked what kind of companies I work with. You've always seemed to assume they were small local businesses." "Well, I thought you work from home, so I figured." "You figured wrong." That evening, I orchestrated my most dramatic revelation yet. I'd arranged for 3 important calls to come in during dinner preparation, a time when the whole family was usually gathered in the kitchen. The first call was from the Department of Transportation. "Dorothy, this is Secretary Morrison's office. The Secretary wanted to personally thank you for the logistics optimization proposal. The projected savings of $200 million over 5 years has the entire department excited about implementation." Richard dropped the plate he was carrying. It shattered on the kitchen floor, but he didn't seem to notice. The second call came 20 minutes later from Marcus Thompson of Thompson Industries. "Dorothy, incredible news. The efficiency improvements you designed have boosted our productivity so dramatically that we're accelerating the timeline for Phase 2. We're talking about a $40 million expansion of your contract." Richard was sitting at the kitchen table now, his dinner untouched, staring at me like I'd sprouted wings. The third call was my masterpiece. Maria, my assistant, called right on schedule. "Dorothy, I have the final numbers for this quarter's revenue. Washington Strategic Solutions brought in $4.2 million. That puts us ahead of last year's pace by 18%. I thanked Maria and hung up, then turned to find Richard gaping at me like a fish out of water. $4.2 million? He whispered. In 3 months? It was a good quarter, I said simply, continuing to set the table as if nothing unusual had happened. Jessica walked in from her shift at the hospital, immediately sensing the tension in the room. What's wrong? Richard, you look like you've seen a ghost. Jess, Richard said slowly, your mom she was on the phone with the government and Boeing, and someone said something about $4 million. Jessica looked at me, and I gave her a subtle nod. We'd discussed this moment during our lunch earlier in the week. Richard, Jessica said gently, sit down. Mom and I need to tell you something. For the next hour, Jessica and I walked Richard through the reality of my business empire. We showed him client testimonials, contract summaries, and revenue reports. We explained how Washington Strategic Solutions had grown from a kitchen table startup to a multi-million-dollar consulting firm serving Fortune 500 companies and government agencies. Richard's face went through a remarkable transformation during that conversation. Confusion gave way to disbelief, disbelief gave way to shock, and shock gave way to something that looked suspiciously like panic. But you work from home, he said weakly. You wear sweatshirts and drink coffee all day. Richard, I said patiently, some of the most powerful people in America work from home. The CEO of Twitter, the founder of GitHub, countless entrepreneurs and executives. The location of my office doesn't determine the value of my work, but you don't act like someone who makes millions of dollars. How exactly should someone who makes millions of dollars act? He struggled with that question, clearly realizing that his assumptions about wealth and success were based more on stereotypes than reality. I don't understand, he said finally. If you're so successful, why do you live so modestly? Why don't you have a fancy car or expensive clothes or a mansion? Because those things don't interest me, I explained. I derive satisfaction from solving complex problems, from building something meaningful, from making a difference in the world. Material displays of wealth have never been important to me. But the house, he started, then stopped. What about the house, Richard? I could see the wheels turning in his head. If I was this successful, if I had this much money, then how was it that he and Jessica could afford their house on their salaries? Jessica took his hand gently. Richard, there's something else you need to know about the house. The color drained from his face. What about the house? Mom bought it 5 years ago, in cash. She transferred it to me as a wedding gift. Richard's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound came out. You mean we don't have a mortgage? We never had a mortgage, Jessica confirmed. Those monthly payments you've been making, they've been going into a savings account Mom set up for our future. Richard buried his face in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with a mixture of shame and horror. Oh God, he whispered. Oh God, what have I done? The days following Richard's revelation were uncomfortable, to put it mildly. He walked around the house like a man in shock, occasionally staring at me as if trying to reconcile the woman he'd dismissed for 3 years with the business mogul he now knew me to be. His parents, Margaret and Robert, didn't take the news. Well, when Richard finally worked up the courage to tell them, "That's impossible," Margaret said when they came over for dinner the following Sunday. "Dorothy, you're a lovely woman, but $4 million? In 3 months? That's more than most people make in a lifetime." "It's true, Mom," Richard said quietly. He'd barely spoken above a whisper since learning the truth. "I've seen the documents. The contracts. The bank statements." Robert shook his head dismissively. "Son, there's got to be some mistake, some confusion. Dorothy works from home, for crying out loud. She doesn't even have an office." "I have 7 offices," I corrected gently. "In Atlanta, Charlotte, Nashville, Jacksonville, Birmingham, Memphis, and Miami. I just prefer working from home when I'm not traveling to client sites." The silence that followed was deafening, but it was Richard's behavior that really concerned me. Instead of apologizing for his years of disrespect, he seemed to be spiraling into something darker. I'd catch him staring at his phone, frantically Googling things like consulting firm revenues and Washington strategic solutions. He was fact-checking me as if he couldn't believe his own reality. Worse, he started making comments that suggested he was more upset about being wrong than about having treated me poorly. "I can't believe you let me look like an idiot for 3 years, he said one evening when Jessica was working a late shift at the hospital. "I let you look like an idiot?" I raised an eyebrow. "Richard, you made assumptions about my work without ever asking for clarification. You dismissed my career without ever investigating what I actually did. How is that my fault? You should have corrected me. You should have told me the truth. I shouldn't have had to defend my career to you in the first place. The fact that you assumed I was unsuccessful says more about your prejudices than my communication skills." He didn't like that answer. Over the next few days, I noticed him making phone calls in hushed tones, always ending them quickly when I entered the room. He was researching me, I realized, probably trying to find some flaw in my story, some reason to discredit what he'd learned. The breaking point came when I overheard him talking to his friend Dave, the same Dave with the dubious real estate. Investment schemes. "I'm telling you, man, something doesn't add up," Richard was saying as he paced in the backyard, thinking he was out of earshot. "She's been living in that modest house, driving that old car, wearing clothes from Target. Rich. People don't act like that." "Maybe she's lying about the money," Dave suggested. "Maybe she's trying to impress you or something." "That's what I'm thinking. I mean, come on. Dorothy Washington running a multi-million-dollar company? It doesn't make sense." I felt anger rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Richard wasn't just having trouble accepting the truth. He was actively trying to undermine it. "I've been doing some research," Richard continued, "looking up her company online, checking business registrations, that kind of thing. There's definitely a Washington Strategic Solutions, but I can't find much detail about their actual operations." Of course he couldn't. I'd deliberately kept a low profile, preferring to let our results speak for themselves rather than engaging in flashy marketing. Most of our clients came through referrals from existing clients or strategic partnerships. "Maybe she's exaggerating her role," Dave said. "Maybe she works for this company, but she's not actually running it." "Exactly. That would make more sense. She's probably some kind of administrative assistant or data entry clerk, and she's spinning it to sound more important than it is." I'd heard enough. Richard wasn't just skeptical. He was determined to tear down the truth because it didn't fit his narrow worldview. He couldn't accept that he'd been wrong about me, so he was creating alternative explanations that would allow him to maintain his superiority complex. That evening, when Jessica came home from work, I sat her down for a serious conversation. "I need you to know that Richard is having a hard time accepting the truth about my business," I told her. "He's been making phone calls, doing research, trying to find ways to discredit what we've told him." Jessica looked tired and frustrated. "Mom, he's just processing everything. It's a lot to take in." "Jessica, he called me a liar to his friend Dave. He suggested that I'm some kind of administrative assistant pretending to be a CEO." Her face darkened. "He said what?" "He can't accept that he was wrong about me, so he's looking for ways to prove that I'm still the unsuccessful woman he always believed me to be." That's ridiculous. We showed him the documents, the contracts, the bank statements. Documents can be fabricated, according to Richard's new theory. He thinks I'm running some kind of elaborate con game. Jessica buried her face in her hands. I don't know what to do with him anymore, Mom. Ever since he found out the truth, he's been impossible. He barely talks to me. He spends all his time on his phone researching you, and when he does talk, it's to complain about how embarrassed he is. Embarrassed about what? About all the things he said to you, about the jokes he made, about suggesting you get a job at Target. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. But instead of apologizing, he's angry. He's angry at you for not correcting him sooner. He's angry at me for not telling him the truth about our living situation. He's angry at the whole world because his assumptions were wrong. I nodded grimly. Jessica, I think we need to have a family meeting, all of us together, because this can't continue. What kind of family meeting? The kind where we lay everything on the table, all the documents, all the proof, all the evidence. He needs to accept reality. And then we establish some new ground rules for how this family is going to operate going forward. Do you think that will help? I thought about Richard's phone calls, his determination to discredit me, his inability to simply apologize for years of disrespect. Honestly, I think Richard is going to fight this until the very end. He's going to demand proof, then question the proof, then demand more proof. He's going to make this as difficult as possible because accepting the truth means accepting that he's been wrong about everything. So what do we do? I smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile I wore in boardrooms when I was about to destroy a competitor's argument with irrefutable facts. We give him exactly what he's asking for. We show him proof so overwhelming, so undeniable, so comprehensive that even Richard Patterson won't be able to rationalize it away. How do we do that? Leave that to me, honey. I've spent my entire career dealing with people who underestimate me. Richard is about to learn why that's always been a mistake. I planned the revelation like a military operation. If Richard wanted proof, I would give him proof so overwhelming that denial would be impossible. I invited Margaret and Robert Patterson to join us for Sunday dinner, telling them I had something important to share with the family. I also asked Patricia, my financial advisor, and Maria, my assistant, to join us via video conference to answer any questions that might arise. The dining room table, the same table where Richard had humiliated me at Thanksgiving, was transformed into a presentation space. I'd laid out folders containing contracts, bank statements, property deeds, client testimonials, and business registration documents. Each folder was labeled clearly: government contracts, Fortune 500 clients, real estate holdings, company financials, industry recognition. At the head of the table, I'd set up my laptop connected to a large monitor, ready to display whatever additional evidence might be required. Richard walked into the dining room and stopped dead in his tracks. What is all this? This, I said, calmly, is the proof you've been demanding. Every document you could possibly need to verify everything I've told you about my business. His parents looked confused. Margaret picked up the government contracts folder and began flipping through it. Dorothy, what are these documents? She asked. Those are contracts between my company and various government agencies. The Department of Transportation, Department of Defense, Centers for Disease Control, Department of Agriculture. Total value of current government contracts, $14.7 million. Robert's hand trembled as he picked up the real estate holdings folder. These are property deeds, he said slowly. 7 properties across 3 states, combined value $4.2 million. All owned outright, no mortgages. Jessica sat down heavily in her chair, even though she'd seen most of these documents before. Seeing them all laid out together was overwhelming even for her. Richard remained standing, his face pale, but his jaw set stubbornly. Anyone can fake documents these days. With computers and printers, you can make anything look official. I'd been expecting this response. I opened my laptop and initiated the video call with Patricia. Good evening, everyone. Patricia Coleman, Senior Financial Advisor with Coleman & Associates Wealth Management. I've been managing Dorothy's investment portfolio for 7 years. Richard's eyes widened. Patricia appeared on the large monitor in a professional office setting, clearly not some actress I'd hired for the occasion. Patricia, I said, could you please verify the current net worth of my portfolio? Certainly. As of Friday's market close, Dorothy's personal net worth is approximately $21.4 million. That includes business assets, real estate holdings, stock portfolios, and liquid cash reserves. Margaret gasped audibly. Robert sat down hard in his chair. Richard shook his head. This is some kind of elaborate setup. You probably hired this woman to play along with your story. Patricia smiled professionally. Mr. Patterson, I understand your skepticism. Would you like me to provide the contact information for my firm so you can verify my credentials independently? Before Richard could answer, I initiated a second video call. Maria appeared on screen from her Miami office. Good evening, Maria. Could you please walk the family through tomorrow's schedule? Of course, Dorothy. Tomorrow, you have a 10 a.m. board presentation with General Dynamics regarding the $37 million efficiency optimization contract. At 2 p.m., you're meeting with the mayor's office about the city infrastructure consulting proposal. Wednesday, you're flying to Seattle for the Boeing Quarterly Review, and Thursday you have the Department of Defense strategic planning session in Washington. Richard was staring at the screen, his mouth slightly open. Maria, I continued, what was last month's revenue for Washington Strategic Solutions? $4.8 million. That brings our year-to-date total to $31.2 million. Thank you, Maria. I ended both video calls and turned to face Richard directly. Richard, I understand this is difficult for you to process. For 3 years, you've believed I was an unsuccessful woman with a fake job. You've made jokes about my work, suggested I needed to get real employment, and treated me like a financial burden on this family. I didn't mean, he started weakly. Yes, you did mean it. You meant every word, every joke, every condescending comment. You believed I was beneath you, that your $85,000 sales job made you more valuable than my multi-million-dollar consulting firm. I picked up another folder and handed it to him. These are testimonials from my clients, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies describing how my work has saved them hundreds of millions of dollars. Government officials praising the efficiency improvements I've designed for critical infrastructure projects. Richard opened the folder with shaking hands. The letterheads alone told the story. Boeing, General Electric, IBM, Microsoft, Ford, Motor Company, the Department of Homeland Security. Here's what I find most interesting, Richard. You've spent the past week trying to debunk my success instead of apologizing for your behavior. You've called me a liar, suggested I'm running some kind of con game, and told your friends that I'm probably just an administrative assistant pretending to be important. His face turned red. He realized I'd overheard his phone conversations. The truth is, Richard, you can't accept being wrong. You can't accept that you spent 3 years disrespecting one of the most successful business consultants in the Southeast. You can't accept that you've been living in a house I bought, eating food I paid for, enjoying a lifestyle subsidized by the work you've been mocking. Margaret was crying now, clutching the property deeds in her hands. Dorothy, we had no idea. Richard never told us. We never realized. Mrs. Patterson, I don't blame you for not knowing. I kept my professional life private. But your son had 3 years to ask questions, to show interest in my work, to treat me with basic respect. Instead, he chose to make assumptions and mock what he didn't understand. I pulled out one final document, the deed to the house we were sitting in. Richard, this is the deed to your house. The house you've been so proud of, the house you thought you were buying with your sales commissions. Look at the owner's name. He read it slowly, his lips moving as he processed the words. Dorothy Washington. I bought this house 5 years ago as an investment property. When you and Jessica got engaged, I transferred it to Jessica as a wedding gift. Every mortgage payment you thought you were making has been going into a savings account for Jessica's future. That's impossible, he whispered. The mortgage you think you have doesn't exist, Richard. You've been living completely rent-free for 3 years while lecturing me about getting a real job. Robert spoke up for the first time. Son, maybe you should apologize to Dorothy. But Richard wasn't ready for apologies. His face had gone from red to purple, and I could see something dangerous building in his expression. This is insane, he said, his voice rising. This whole thing is insane. You're telling me that you're some kind of secret millionaire who's been pretending to be poor for 3 years? That doesn't make sense. Rich people don't act like you. They don't live like you. Richard, Jessica said quietly, stop. No, I won't stop. This is manipulation, Jess. Can't you see that? Your mother has been playing some kind of psychological game with us, making us think she needed our help when she was secretly rich the whole time. I stood up slowly, my hands flat on the table. Richard Patterson, you have exactly 1 chance to apologize for 3 years of disrespect, mockery, and condescension. 1 chance to acknowledge that you were wrong about me and wrong about my work. I'm not apologizing for anything, he said defiantly. If this is all true, then you're the one who should apologize for lying to us. The room fell completely silent. Jessica was staring at her husband in horror. Margaret and Robert looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. I smiled, the same cold smile I'd worn at that Thanksgiving dinner. Very well, Richard. You've made your choice. I walked to my home office and returned with a folder I'd been hoping I wouldn't need to use. It contained Richard's financial profile, the credit reports, employment history, and debt analysis that Patricia had prepared. Since you've refused to apologize and accused me of manipulation, I think it's time we discussed your financial situation, Richard. His face went white. What are you talking about? I'm talking about your $30,000 in credit card debt. I'm talking about your car loan that's $15,000 underwater. I'm talking about the mortgage pre-approval you were denied 6 months before marrying Jessica. How do you know about that? Because unlike you, when I make assumptions about people, I do my research to verify them. I opened the folder and began reading. TechFlow Solutions, your current employer, has had 2 rounds of layoffs in 18 months. Industry analysts predict they'll be bankrupt within 2 years. Richard's jaw dropped. You had me investigated? I had you researched, the same way I research any potential business risk. And Richard, you are definitely a risk. Jessica was staring at her husband with growing horror. Richard, is this true? Do you really have $30,000 in debt? It's not as bad as it sounds, he stammered. It's worse, I continued, because that investment opportunity you were so excited about, your friend Dave has been involved in 2 failed real estate ventures that lost investors over $5 million combined. The commercial properties he's pushing are distressed assets with environmental contamination and legal issues. Margaret was crying openly now. Richard, you didn't tell us about any debts. I can handle my own finances, he said defensively. Clearly you can't, I replied. Which is why you've been living rent-free in my house while plotting to get your hands on my money to fund Dave's latest scam. I wasn't plotting anything. You coached Jessica on how to emotionally manipulate me into funding your investment schemes. You told her to make me feel guilty about having money sitting in bank accounts. You turned my own daughter into an unwitting accomplice in your attempt to exploit me financially. Jessica stood up abruptly. Is that true, Richard? Did you tell me to manipulate my mother? Richard's silence was answer enough. Get out, Jessica said quietly. Jess, come on, let me explain. Get out of my house. Get out of my mother's house. Get out now. Jessica, please, I love you. I made mistakes, but we can work through this. You spent 3 years mocking my mother while living off her generosity. You tried to turn me against her so you could steal her money. You refused to apologize, even when faced with overwhelming evidence of your own ignorance and cruelty. Jessica's voice was growing stronger with each word. There's nothing to work through, Richard. We're done. Richard looked desperately around the room, but found no allies. His parents were staring at him like they'd never seen him before. Mom, Dad, say something. Robert shook his head slowly. Son, you've made your bed. Dorothy has been nothing but gracious to this family, and you've repaid her kindness with disrespect and schemes. I'm ashamed of you. I raised you better than this, Margaret added through her tears. How could you treat Dorothy this way? How could you be so cruel? Richard grabbed Jessica's hand. Please, Jess, I'll apologize. I'll make it right. It's too late for apologies, I said firmly. You had your chance, Richard. Multiple chances. You chose pride over humility, greed over gratitude, and cruelty over kindness. I pulled out one final document. This is a 30-day notice to vacate. Since the house belongs to Jessica and she's asked you to leave, you have 30 days to find alternative housing. You can't do this to me. I have rights. Actually, you don't. You have no legal claim to this property, no rental agreement, no lease. You've been living here as Jessica's guest, and that invitation has been revoked. 3 weeks later, Richard moved out. He took only his personal belongings, leaving behind the furniture and appliances he'd thought he owned, but which had actually been gifts from me to Jessica. The divorce proceedings were swift and uncontested. Richard's lawyer advised him not to fight it once he understood the financial realities involved. 6 months after that Thanksgiving dinner, my life had transformed completely. No more hiding my success, no more tolerating disrespect, no more pretending to be smaller than I was to make others comfortable. Jessica and I grew closer than we'd ever been. She started taking an active interest in my business, occasionally joining me for client meetings and learning about strategic consulting. She began to understand that her mother wasn't just successful, she was actually making a difference in the world, helping companies become more efficient and profitable while saving jobs and improving working conditions. I purchased a beautiful penthouse in downtown Atlanta while keeping the family home as well. Jessica chose to stay in the house where she'd grown up, and I split my time between both residences. The National Manufacturing Excellence Award ceremony was held in Chicago, with Jessica as my guest. When they called my name as the winner, she cheered louder than anyone else in the auditorium. Margaret and Robert Patterson sent me a heartfelt apology letter, acknowledging their role in enabling Richard's behavior and expressing their deep regret for the years of disrespect I'd endured. I wrote back graciously, accepting their apology and inviting them to visit Jessica whenever they wanted. They were good people who had raised a troubled son. That didn't make them responsible for his choices. Richard, I heard through mutual acquaintances, moved back in with his parents and eventually found work at a smaller sales company. Dave's investment opportunity collapsed exactly as I'd predicted, taking several investors' money with it. Richard's financial situation, already precarious, became even more challenging after the divorce. But I didn't waste energy on resentment. I'd learned long ago that success is the best revenge, and I had more success than I knew what to do with. On the anniversary of that Thanksgiving dinner, Jessica and I sat in my new penthouse, looking out over the Atlanta skyline. She was telling me about a new efficiency project she was proposing at the hospital, inspired by some of the methodologies she'd learned from observing my work. "Mom," she said suddenly, "I need to ask you something." "What's that, honey?" "Why? Didn't you ever remarry? You're successful, beautiful, intelligent. You could have had anyone." I thought about that question for a long moment. I suppose I was too busy building an empire to worry about finding someone to rule it with me. And now? I smiled, looking out at the city lights twinkling below us. Now I'm thinking that a good queen doesn't need a king. She just needs people who understand her worth. Like me? Especially like you. We sat in comfortable silence. Two strong women who had weathered a storm and come out stronger on the other side. Sometimes people ask me if I regret keeping my success secret for so long. The answer is no. That experience taught me valuable lessons about human nature, about family dynamics, and about the importance of demanding respect rather than hoping for it. It also taught me that when someone shows you who they are, you should believe them the first time. Richard showed me exactly who he was, with every condescending comment, every dismissive joke, every attempt to diminish my worth. I just chose to ignore the evidence until it became impossible to overlook. But most importantly, it taught me that a woman's power doesn't come from the approval of others. It comes from her own accomplishments, her own strength, and her own refusal to accept anything less than the respect she deserves. The next time someone asks me when I'm going to get a real job, I'll be ready with the perfect answer. I already have one. Several of them, actually. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story touched you, please give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel, stay healthy, and value yourselves.